Chapter 68. The bonds dropped away and Vi started fighting. She swore constantly under her breath to use her talent, but she wasn't angry. She'd always thought she was a cold, heartless bitch. She'd taken hold of that identity. It had made her strong against the nightly emptiness, the soul bankruptcy she'd carried for as long as she could remember. With the declaration that she would never serve the God King, melodramatic or not, she felt that she'd made her first deposit in that bank ever. Now she was fighting for something. No, for someone, and it was the first selfless thing she'd ever done. The Ferrari hunched and its bones sped beneath its skin. In the time it took Vi to armor herself, it had become something like a centaur, except instead of a horse's body, it had a cougar's. It was shorter, more mobile on its 4 legs, but it had a human torso and arms. It grabbed a spear in its human hands and launched itself after Kyler, who dashed behind a pillar. Vi sprinted up the steps 3 at a time to attack the God King. He was about to find out how wrong he'd been about that compulsion. Let Kyler fight the beast. She'd cut it off at its source. She was drawing back her sword when she hit the ward that extended 10 feet around the God King like a bubble. It was like sprinting into a wall. She found herself sprawled on the stairs. She must have rolled part way down them without even noticing. Her nose was bleeding and her head was ringing. She blinked at Kyler. The man was a virtuoso. As the Ferrari charged with spear leveled, Kyler waited until the last moment and then launched himself forward. Knives flashed as he passed over the beast, and its spear passed inches under him, harmlessly. But he wasn't done. He threw out a hand and somehow hooked the marble pillar, scoring it with a smoking gouge. As the Ferrari spun to catch him, Kyler emerged from the other side of the pillar and flew over the Ferrari's back, blades flashing again. Kyler landed in a crouch, one hand on the ground, the other on his sheathed sword. The Ferrari paused, bleeding profusely, the mouthy skin cut open over the back of one hand, one shoulder, and across the cougar's haunches. The blood was red, all too human, but even as Vi watched, the gouges knit together in scars. The Ferrari threw its spear at him. Kyler deflected it with a hand, but the Ferrari was already moving. As Kyler leapt toward the wall, the Ferrari slashed one arm at him, and in the space of the heartbeat that it took for its arm to move forward, the arm elongated. Bones snapped into place, and an enormous scythe blade of a claw swept through the air. Kyler flipped off the wall, directly into the path of the claw. It slammed him to the ground. Vi thought he was surely dead, but even as Kyler hit the ground, the claw snapped off and skipped along the floor away from the Ferrari. Kyler had somehow managed to draw his sword and block the slash. The Ferrari, its left leg hanging limp and boneless, looked stunned. It sank into itself, becoming a great cat. Before the beast could attack again, Vi finally gathered her wits and charged it, screaming. It wheeled. She danced just outside the range of its claws, the sides of which had armored into bone. Kyler got back to his feet, but he was swaying from side to side, dazed. The Ferrari dashed away from Vi and touched its belly to the ground where its dead claw lay. In a second, that flesh was part of the Ferrari again. Bones shifted, and it stood as a tall man with bone swords for arms. It seemed more comfortable in this guise, thickly muscled, quicker than any man, much of its skin reinforced with bone armor plates. Together Vi and Kyler fought. Kyler was capable of aerial moves Vi couldn't even comprehend, flipping off walls and the pillars, always landing on his feet like a cat, always leaving bloody furrows with its steel claws. Vi had less strength, even with her talent, but she was quick. The Ferrari morphed again and again. It became a slight man with a living chain that it whipped around its head and flung around the pillars, hoping those mouthy links would catch either one of them. One of the links snagged Kyler's sleeve in mid-flight. It flipped him off balance, and he crashed into the floor. The Ferrari pulled the chain in until Vi's sword passed in the inch between Kyler's skin and his sleeve and freed him. Kyler didn't even pause. He was just up and fighting. Then the Ferrari was a giant with a warhammer. Marble exploded as it laid about itself with a huge weapon. Kyler and Vi ranged through the illusion of battle on the throne room floor, fighting as desperately as those men and women fought. As they fought together, Kyler and Vi began to not just fight in unison, but with unity. As Vi understood Kyler's strength, she could move, counting on him to react appropriately. They were warriors, they were wet boys, and they understood. For Vi, who had always had trouble with words, battle was truth. She and Kyler fought together, leaping, meeting in midair, pushing off to go flying in a new direction before the Ferrari could respond. They covered each other, saved each other's lives. Kyler clipped off the end of a bone mace Vi could have never avoided. Vi said Gracchos, and jaws closed on Kyler's arm and then bounced off. It was for her a holy moment. She had never communed with another, never trusted another so implicitly as she communed with and trusted Kyler. In this, through this, she understood the man in ways 1,000,000 words wouldn't have revealed. They were in total harmony, and the miracle was how natural it was. At the same time, despair rose in her. They cut the Ferrari 100 times, 200. They attacked its eyes, its mouth. They cut off parts of its body. It bled, and its total mass decreased by a few pounds. But that was all. They cut it, and it healed, but they could never make a mistake. Once that skin touched theirs, they would die. I also cut. Kyler alighted on the side of a pillar and stopped. Ruins were glowing in Kakari black, edged in blue, along his arm. He stared at them. You what? He asked. I didn't say anything, Vi said. Her eyes were on an enormous spider chittering on the floor in front of her. Stupid! How slow am I? Kyler said, dropping to the floor. Is that a rhetorical question? The Kakari poured a dark liquid from his hand onto his sword, but then the liquid solidified as a thin sword. Kyler cut left and right, and spider legs went flying. It wasn't like hacking through bone. He was shearing them off like butter. He dodged back, and the spider gathered its legs to itself, but this time the stumps kept bleeding. They smoked and wouldn't allow new limbs to grow there. It morphed back into the man with the swords for arms, but now the wounds were on the man's chest, still flowing with blood and smoking. It roared and attacked Kyler. Kyler slashed left and right, and the sword arms tumbled across the floor. He rammed the Kakari into the Ferali's chest. With a sharp motion, he pulled it down to the creature's groin. Smoke billowed, blood gushed. Kyler yanked the sword up, making another huge cut. He saw it too late. The Ferali's skin drew back from the sword, like a pond might crater when a stone falls into it, only to burst upward. The skin rushed up the sword all at once. It engulfed Kyler's hand. He threw himself back, but the Ferali, limp now, fell forward with him, attached to his hand. Kyler jerked the sword back and forth, and smoke gushed from the Ferali as he gutted it, but it didn't lose its grip. Kyler reached for a dagger, but he'd used them all in the battle. Vi, he shouted, cut it off! She hesitated. Cut off my hand! She couldn't do it. The skin twitched again, and it rushed up his forearm. Kyler screamed and twisted. A blade of Kakari formed along the ridge of his left hand, and he cut off his right arm. Released from the pull of the dying Ferali, he collapsed backward. He held the gushing stump in his left hand. A moment later, black metal shimmered in every exposed vein, and the bleeding stopped. A black cap sheathed his stump. Kyler looked at Vi dumbly. 10 feet away, the Ferali's corpse was oozing. It began to break apart, weaves of magic unraveling. The mouthy skin rippled and evaporated, and then all that was left was stinking ropes of meat and sinew and bone. That, the Gong King's voice said, was impressive, Kyler. You showed me some things I wasn't aware the Kakari could do. Most instructive. And Vi, you'll serve admirably, and not just in my bed. Something in Vi snapped. In the last 2 days, she'd changed everything. A new Vi was fighting to be born, and the God King was here, saying nothing had changed. The new Vi would be a stillbirth. She'd go back to being a whore. She'd go back to being the same cold, hard bitch. She thought that life was the only one open to her, so she'd borne the unbearable. But having seen a way to be a woman she didn't hate, she couldn't go back. Get it through your fat head, Gar, she said, even as she felt magical bonds wrapping around her limbs and Kyler's again. I won't serve you! Gareth smiled godly benevolence. The feisty ones always make me hard. Kyler, Vi said, snap out of it! You gotta help me kill this fucking twist! The God King laughed. Compulsion doesn't hold on everyone, Vi. The Nile's magic would have freed most people. About 19 years ago, there was some Syrian slut that I seduced during a diplomatic trip. I sent men to collect her when I found out she was pregnant, but she ran away before they got there. When I found out she bore a girl, I dismissed the matter. I usually have my daughters drowned. It's good practice for my boys. It makes them tough. But it wasn't worth the effort. Compulsion, Vi, only works on family, and sometimes not on boys. You're not my father, Vi said. You're just a sick fuck who's about to die. Kyler! Now, Vi, let's not get all teary-eyed, Gareth Ursel said. You're nothing to me but 5 minutes of pleasure and a spoonful of seed. Well, that's not true. You see, Vi, you're a wet boy I can trust. You will never disobey me, never betray me. Vi was gripped by terror tighter than the magic that bound her limbs. Possibilities were dying on every side. Kyler stirred. His eyes came back into focus. He wiggled his eyebrows at her, trying to be charming. The outrageous cuteness of it cracked her paralysis. His pale blue eyes said, "You with me?" Hers answered with a fierce, desperate joy that needed no translation. Under his breath, Kyler said, "You take his attention, I'll take his life." He smiled, and the rest of Vi's fear blew away. It was a real smile, with no desperation. There was no doubt in Kyler's eyes. Any additional obstacle, whether magical bonds or the loss of an arm, would only sweeten his victory. Killing the God King was Kyler's destiny. "You leave me no choice," Gareth Ursel said. He pursed his lips. "Daughter, kill Kyler." The Kakari opened and devoured the bonds holding Vi and Kyler. Vi was moving, beginning a flashy, eye-grabbing stunt. Then everything stopped. There was a gap of volition. In her mind's eye, Vi was leaping through the air, flying toward the God King, her blade descending, his face twisting into a rictus of fear as he saw that his shields were gone, as he realized she'd defeated his compulsion. But that was only her imagination. A shock of impact ran up Vi's arm. Her wrist flexed as if to complete a horizontal slash through a heart. But she saw nothing, knew nothing except that there was a blank. The gap cleared, and Vi was aware once more. Her fingers were uncurling from the familiar grip of her favorite knife. Kyler, so slowly, so painfully slowly, was falling. He drifted toward the floor, his head arched back in a slow whiplash from having her knife rammed into his back. His dark hair rippled from the shock. It wasn't until he hit the floor that Vi realized that Kyler was dead. She had killed him. "That, my dear daughter," Gareth Ursel said, "is compulsion."